I'm dead. Now what? The secret isn't to how you're going to die or when you're going to die. The secret to death is what happens next. This is a question that's put before me often. Immediately upon leaving your body, your spirit returns to its natural form, and this is something that you can actually feel. As an example, we had to put our dog down because of an illness, compassionately, and I was holding our dog's collar, and then also I had my hand around his chest area as the veterinarian was giving this shot. And immediately, you could feel the heart stop and the lungs stop breathing, and there's just pause that you could actually feel the spirit that was infinitesimally small. I say small, like a feather that was leaving the body. And I could feel his spirit, and all I could do was cry. I was a little bit shocked about the delay of time, but it was such a beautiful feeling. But it wasn't because of a fear of loss, but rather the spirit of the dog reconnecting with Source. And when someone dies, they first enter a space. We could call it a place too, but it's more accurately described as a space where transition begins. And this is the exact moment where death takes place during this transition. This transition is obvious because it's no longer a need for breathing or eating or, of course, even thinking in any regard. This portal, though, is the same one that I talked about in True Connections with Weston Jolly called I Talk to Dead People. If you haven't listened to that podcast, or if you don't remember, when you're born or when you die, again, there's this portal, and this is the same place where you come into the light. When your mother was fully dilated, her cervix was opened to give space or room for you to be born. And during this exact moment, which is actually called the transition phase, your mom's body is starting to involuntarily push you as her baby into the light. This is the exact same portal at birth as it is at death. Now, obviously, you don't return to your mother's womb upon death, but you are returned to Source, which is the mother of us all. So in one sense, you are returned to the Divine Mother, the mother of Source. This space, or this portal, is the same in the beginning as it is the end. This too is why Source has accurately stated that I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. In childbirth, it's obviously called the transition phase because your mother is again transitioning from one place to the next. The transition from life to death is the same frequency as when you came into this world, as you were born. It's the same doorway or the same portal or the same opening in where life starts and where life ends. Another way of conceiving this would be, pun intended, by the way, is for you to picture a rocket, where you have a rocket that's using all of its energy to thrust itself into to the air, and then suddenly 2 minutes later we have the transition phase, where we have this smaller vehicle that comes out of the mothership for the very first time under its power to begin to come out and to enter its own journey. And regardless of how death occurs, the soul is instantly returned via this transition phase back to Source. And of course, the very first thing that has to be addressed is the perception of identity. And if there's been a sudden death, there's a strong likelihood that the soul is still going to be holding on to a thought resonance of who they were when they were embodied. They're not embodied. And this is why people sometimes who have died and come back into their bodies through like an NDE experience, a near-death experience, they say that they have left their body or that they were disembodied. And sometimes people want to know what it's like to be, outside of your body. And my response is it's pretty much the same as when you dream. Certainly you can remain heavy in your body, but when you dream, most of us dream during the dream state, and sometimes we can have a feeling or sensation of flying. And I've put together 2 blogs on this subject. What is the spiritual meaning of your dreams? And then this other one, are your flying dreams real? And it helps to describe this process if you're looking to get more details about coming out of your body. But it's more accurate to say that when you're flying, that you're literally leaving your body behind to return to your spiritual essence. And after realizing that you're no longer alive, that your heart isn't beating, or you're not longer physically enabled, this transition occurs. And this is where you find yourself first aware that is what's commonly called this tunnel of light. And this light tunnel is like a car where you drive through the side of a mountain and you've been underground and you can see the light on the other side. But in this light, the tunnel of light, it's immense and it just draws you into the light. And it's something that you can really, really feel, and it's really, really beautiful. But also in this light, which you could describe as a tunnel with lots of different doorways, there are countless places or portals where we have these connections to all of your life experiences. Kind of like an umbilical cord that tethers you to every part of your life that you've experienced. And I guess you could give consideration that the length of this tunnel of light equates in some kind of linear way to your linear life. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. But if you appreciate that when you're going through this tunnel of light, you're being introduced to what's called this life review. But in the life review, there is an idea through lots of times religious conditioning that there's some kind of judgment associated with a life review. And let me be really clear, there is no judgment day. And if you're really listening, this means that there's no judgment while you're alive. And this is really understood easily because Source, which is of course unconditional, the author of all unconditional love, doesn't offer any judgment. This is a concept that's only on this side of the fence, ever. So if you've been baptized into this thinking, pun intended, then this too is a part of your reawakening to return to your true spiritual essence. In your life review, you'll see that in the tunnel of light that you begin to experience every millisecond of the perceptions that you've had from the opposite perspective, meaning the people who were interrelating with you. It's a very thorough place. And ultimately, all of your experiences are no longer stored within your body or in your brain, but in the Akashic Records. And the Akashic Records is where all things are stored. Now, it's important for you to understand all things of life are just stored there, but all spiritual things too. And if it helps, then think of the Akashic Records as the biggest library that you've ever could possibly imagine, where every thought, every experience, every creation, every manifestation, joy, sadness, happiness, event has ever taken place in this place called the Akashic Records. So after your death, you begin to process your life through these life experiences in this life review, again in the tunnel of light. But before we get any further down the path, sometimes it helps to understand what happens next after you die. I should probably backtrack just a little bit to tell you about who could be there to greet you. And oftentimes it's those people who are familiar to you. And this can be a deceased father or mother or brother, a friend or a spouse. And it can very much include specific angels or guides. Now, I say this because sometimes we may have not ever embraced or believed in spiritual guides to be real, but you'll find them to be there outside of your belief system. So at the physical time of death, it's quite common to have people who, again, I'll use the terms, have agreed to physically support you in your physical choice to leave your embodiment. And this too can be a spouse or brother or sister, mother or father or a friend. And of course, it can be also people who are dedicated to your assistance as nurses or doctors or even hospice workers that are assisting you as you go to leave your body. So after you're met with people or by the angelic realm, there's this letting go of the shell or the ego, which is supported by the body and, of course, your physical self. And you have this beginning of the life review to see how everyone was perceiving you through your life interaction. Now, this is, again, the tunnel of light and all these different portals as a means to have comprehension of everything that you've been going through. And this isn't necessarily done in a time sequential, meaning we don't necessarily go from the birth to the end, like we would in kindergarten, first grade, third grade, but because we can kind of hop around to different events that we were experiencing during our life as a means to process this life review. So when we talk about this tunnel, we should have an understanding that there is no time that is associated with how long it takes somebody to go through the transition from the beginning to the end. And so time, of course, isn't real and isn't measured in seconds or hours or days. And because of that, there isn't a need to measure how long it takes somebody to get through the transition of the tunnel, again, after they're died. And sometimes there is a desire when people do die that they have an immediate desire to communicate with someone else that's here on Earth. And by far the simplest means of communication is when a person here on this side goes to sleep. And so a dream state can be entered into, and this is why we have flying dreams, or we have connection with someone who has passed, because they're wanting to communicate with you. And dreams are just a wonderful place where you and the other person who has died can have this state of completion. And after death, this can include things that weren't said or incomplete in nature. And again, when there's a sudden death, the drastic change of being alive 1 minute and the next idea that someone is dead is very sudden, of course, and dramatic. But there's an idea that there's a desire to communicate. So if you compare this to someone who has been in a lifelong condition or illness, then death in those kinds of states are oftentimes a relief. And we're very, very excited for someone to actually let go of their body for the sake of pain. But when we come to the idea that there is so much being processed, that people will often ask questions like, why did they have to die? Or why did somebody take so long to die? And these are great questions, but when we do let go of the body, of course I should have mentioned this a moment ago, there's no pain. And the processing of physical pain is just released. But we do have the perceived pain, I guess you can call it that, of the past. While this isn't encouraged to hold on to that, someone can, and they can actually get, I'll call it stuck in this light, where they can find themselves hanging around an association that took place in their physical life. For an example, an addict who dies, doesn't really matter the kind of addiction. Lots of times they do circles around a particular spot within the tunnel of light. And this is akin to, I guess you could think of it like the moon orbiting the Earth, where only in this state it doesn't progress. It's another way of thinking about it, I guess, would be like episodic TV, where there's the same program that we've seen 1,000 times, and the deceased person hasn't completed the process. So again, they're just orbiting the same place within the tunnel of light. From an earthly perspective, when someone is stuck, we call these kinds of entities or these ghosts ghosts. They're stuck in an earthly attachment. And these entities or ghosts are stuck in houses and cars, bars, or a city or a place. And sometimes they're stuck into an event. And while sometimes these entities do play tricks, or they try to position themselves in a dominant means, really what they're trying to address is some physical part of their past has not been resolved. And to understand how ghosts inhabit a place, I just want to share this real life example. My family and I were staying in a bed and breakfast in Denver many years ago. And when we first checked in, I could actually feel this energy of ghosts or entities that were running up and down the hallway in this very large house. And we had made arrangements to have 2 rooms, one for my wife and I and the other for our children, and it had a door between the 2 rooms. But once we got up to our rooms, I went to say something to our whole family about what I was feeling, and the kids and my wife said, "We know," because they could feel the spiritual entities also that were in the house. And these entities were attached to, of course, the house, but in our rooms. But we had rented the rooms, and so we gathered as one, and we prayed, and we asked very specifically that we would have privacy in our rooms. And this was agreed upon by the entities of the house, but as a part of our spiritual negotiation, if you want to call it that, the whole family agreed that the ghost wouldn't be allowed into our rooms, into our bathroom, and certainly they were allowed to be down the hallways, including the kitchen area. So in essence, we came to an agreement. So we stayed the one night in the house, and our family wasn't bothered as we had asked and per our understanding. But the conversation became interesting the next day with the owners of the house, because they were telling us about how they had purchased this house and how they were in the process of remodeling it. And they had all kinds of things happening. And they were going into details about the conversion process from being a house to a B&B. And we were all kind of eating our foods quickly, thinking that we wanted to finish our stay, but we weren't necessarily scared as much as appreciative that that's what the owners wanted to create, and certainly the deceased entities, but we weren't necessarily wanting to continue to coexist in that space. So if a small group of souls is attached to a particular place, that maybe in this case that they had lived or inhabited, then they were stuck, again, think of the tunnel of light, in this endless loop in this one particular space. But through spiritual encouragement, these entities will leave, and they will let go, and they will further ascend to the light. But please observe that these entities are stuck most of the time in hospitals or bars, houses, and sometimes cities, or maybe even specific events. And I've helped many homeowners release stuck energy or entities that were attached to a house. The majority of the time is so that they could sell the property. When a person who is ready to communicate to someone who is still physically on Earth, they may create reminders or patterns or signals to prompt the living person to initiate a communication. This is where a spiritual medium such as myself acts as a liaison in assisting. I think it's important to understand that as a spiritual channel, that when I'm asked to bridge the two entities, that would be, you as the client or the person who has passed, that sometimes as the interpreter, I'm given words or language and meaning that only you and the dead person have an understanding to. And oftentimes, the person who is dead wants to provide specific information to you as a means to communicate that this bridge, if you will, is authentic. And therefore, they'll offer very direct communications, such as names or very specific things in terms of a shoe or the environment, that again, only you and that person would have understanding. But if there's a conflict in the person where we're tapping into someone who has existed here on Earth, and yet they're coming back into this conversation through this mediumship, there is a challenge to be here or to be present, and oftentimes they are maybe even a little resonant to participate. They don't have to, but there's encouragement for them to do that, and oftentimes for you as well. And the choice to be associated with one's identity after the fact, meaning if I died and someone goes to connect with me, they may use my name, right, or they'd be assuming my personality would remain the same. But through this transition of me coming down the tunnel, I'm going to lose more and more of my perceived sense of self. That would be my name or my association to my embodiment, which is all normal. So this can create, of course, a little bit of a challenge, so that if someone's being asked to remove themselves from their physical identity, and yet they're being called upon, I think of it like an ID card that we use sometimes to come into a building or not, that this is who I am. And sometimes people will do that who have passed, and you can participate in actually observing and seeing how this person who has been dead for a while in this transition of going through the light will again become less and less attached to their personality, and they'll begin to let go. And this kind of brings us to this space of understanding that sometimes when we go to tune in for, let's say, an individual that has passed, there's a lot of people who queue up. And I say queue up, I'm speaking of people who have died, that suddenly want to have access to this side of the fence. In essence, there's a direct line, that being the channel or the liaison to help. And because of that, there's a desire for spiritual energies to queue up to want to have dialogue with you. And of course, that has to be regulated. And so I asked that these entities, if you will, to create a line actually, and to stay there in line, because I'm being asked to connect with this one person, and I want to make sure that I have your permission to facilitate, someone that you didn't necessarily call upon. And it can help them in terms of their life review, or to say hello, or to offer states of completion. There is a beauty in the participation in this process, and of course it's very, very touching to be involved or to be asked to be a part of it. In summary of I'm Dead, Now What?, I think it's fair to share that the dead want to be heard just as much as maybe you want to communicate with them, perhaps even more so. In talking with someone who has passed, well, it can be really, really healing for you and certainly for the party. This is especially true of someone who's passed who may be wanting to offer themselves as a spiritual guide. And so in this moment, I want to offer a very specific honor to someone that was once known as Susie, who was my sister-in-law. Susie died really suddenly as a result of a brain aneurysm at the age of 37. And I just wanted to really thank her for all of her love and personal attention that she's given to me and her sister and certainly her nephew and niece, because Susie was a very, very special being, very strong in her personality, having modeled and created successful businesses, but she was also quite challenged with some things of childhood that were unresolved that most likely caused her premature death. And that said, I wanted to dedicate this entire podcast or this video to Susie and her beautiful life. Susie actually continues to be a very special member of our family, enhancing us in terms of our spiritual understanding, certainly our direction, and really remains active. And there's just no other way to put that. So a long way back, I wrote a piece that I dedicated to Susie called A Beautiful Life. And if you should be interested in taking a peek at it, about her life and her impact, you can check it out in terms of the podcast. I do hope that you can see that speaking to the dead is truly something that can be cherished and honored. And in that respect, I remain really endeared to be called to the process every time that I'm asked to channel. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast and this film. I look forward to seeing you the next opportunity of True Connections with me, Weston Jolly, as your host. Thank you.